Thursday, I'm missing one of the sign-in sheets. Someone accidentally took it home with them. So if you accidentally have that at some point, it ended up in the front that day. So I'm not like accusing front people of doing that. I'm just saying there's a higher probability that maybe it got stuck in your papers. So if you could do a little check in your paperwork at some time, that would be helpful. If not, we just can't count attendance that day. So we will survive, we will endure, but it's also, I think your classmates would want that sheet back. So please remember to turn these in unless you really want to mount a copy on your wall in a creepy stalker way. It's kind of the theme that we have. So that's perfectly fine. I can make a copy for you and black out everybody's name. So let's see. We finished with the last chapter, right?
Yes, we did.
Yes. Okay. So for this next chapter, we are going to be focusing on visual perception. And what you see in most undergraduate cognitive processes classes is a major emphasis on visual stuff and kind of not a discussion on any other sense really at all. And it's not because the other senses aren't important. It's just because the visual cortex is the largest area of the brain in comparison to the other senses, more research has been dedicated to it. So at the undergraduate level, they just tend to focus on visual perception. If you remember back to intro to Psych, I don't know how soon that was for some of you. I think you spent a fair amount of time discussing sensation. So how do said light waves enter your brain, etc. We're not going to focus on that because the true nature of psychologists, save for those that are involved in psychophysics, want to know how our expectations shape reality, not how a light wave is transduced into a neural signal. So we're going to jump into brain stuff pretty quickly in this particular chapter. But I have an example that I want to do with you guys that I feel represents the visual. We're going to represent the visual system with auditory stuff because we can. So we're going to watch a video. You've probably maybe seen it before. It's a little bit old, but I feel like it made its rounds on YouTube so far. So what I want you to imagine as you're watching this, well, let me tell you what we're watching. So we're going to watch an Ode to Joy flash mob. You guys know what a flash mob is, right? Starts with a few people, more people join, and then their two friends join, and so on and so on. So you go from one flash to an entire mob. So do you know the song Ode to Joy? You know the melody once you hear it. It can be even simplified to a nursery rhyme. But it was the main theme in Beethoven's Final Symphony, his 9th symphony. And so it's some musicologists have referred to it as kind of like the theme song for the world. So take that if what you will. If not, it's the 9th symphony is a really good symphony anyway. So that is neither here nor there. What I want you to do is I want you to think as each musician as a neuron in the visual system. So that could be a neuron in the retina, that could be a neuron in the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus, that could be a neuron way back in the visual cortex, I don't care. But each musician is a neuron. So let me ask you this. I know some of you might have more insight into this than others. In a symphony, is every musician playing the same instrument?
No.
No. Okay. Is every instrument in the same family? As in, do they make exactly the same sound?
No.
No. There's like brass instruments that are super loud. There are woodwind instruments that are quieter. I kind of think of them as like foresty-ish, like more natural. There's stringed instruments that are able to be very connective in their sound. So every has a job, a contribution to the entire piece. So every musician is a neuron in the visual system. Every audience member that you're going to watch in this flash mob, I want you to think of it as a specific neuron in any part of the cortex. Remember, we talked about the association cortex is essentially 75% of the brain that's not the sensory strip and the motor strip. You remember talking about that? I know it was a long weekend. I'm going to take that as a resounding yes, even though people really didn't respond to my question. All right, motor strip, sensory strip, everything else is the association cortex. Okay? So, the audience member is part of the association cortex. So, what I want you to imagine is that the neurons are sending musical signals to the parts of the brain that process what each musical signal means. So, we already talked about how each musician plays a different instrument. So, there's your neuronal specification. Each musician's job is to send a different signal. And each musician has to listen to all the other musicians in order to play it right. So if you ever have played music with anybody, it's a full body experience because you need to make sure that you are playing the music at the right time. Because what we're going to see is that neurons to some degree listen to each other as well. One thing that I will repeat later is heavy in psychology, which is that neurons that fire together wire together. Another way of thinking that is that if neurons consistently send signals at the same time, they're going to become bros, buddies. They're not gender specific neurons. Probably going to get in trouble for saying something like that at some point. So the other thing that I want you to think of is that each musician that is listening to all of the other musicians, and depending on what the music is requiring, is going to play louder or softer at some points. So sometimes certain signals are more important than other signals. Sometimes all of the signals are important, sometimes none of the signals are important. So we'll follow up on the audience in just a minute. Okay? So let's see what's going on here. Sorry. Here we go. Okay, I promise I'm not going to stop it over and over again because I know that's really irritating. I'm irritating myself right now. But so those of you who have heard Ode to Joy before, were you able to pick up that melody with that bass player? No, you're like, who is this guy? Like, you had one job. That was to play the name of the YouTube video, and you didn't do that. So what I'm going to tell you here is that the signal from one neuron is not enough to give a really strong representation of everything. We need more signals from a symphony of neurons in order to provide an enriched explanation of what is going on into the environment. I'm going to push play and walk away, and we will talk after it's over. I would learn the lights in here, but apparently not. Okay, so after we got to the very end of that blessing, did it feel like a more, I hate to use the word enriched because I just used that, but did it feel like a more representative sound of like the complexities of the real world versus one person playing? Maybe a little bit. Did it, or let me take a step back. As audience members yourselves, if you had heard the piece before, did you have any expectations about what was going to happen?
A little bit, yeah.
A little bit? I don't know where that sound came from. There you are, okay. Did you kind of think like, well, I have this formation of the melody and, well, obviously this isn't an hour-long thing, so what are they gonna put the melody together in order to make this a 5-minute YouTube video? Maybe, or you just like,
Yeah.
I heard it before, it's fine.
Well, yeah, also because, like, the original writing of the symphony had, like, this plus, like, cannons and, like, cymbals and, like, a million, and, like, a bunch of other things, too,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah, it was definitely, it's a large piece. Those of you who, have not heard this before, do you remember that part before like the full choir came in where everything got really soft? You just experienced it. Yes or no? Yes, okay. You can lie to me, I just need you to respond. Okay, once it got really low, really slow, what did you think was gonna happen? Did you think it was just going to die out, or do you think it was going to go off in like blazing glory? Or are you just literally so passive right now? You have 0 neurons firing at this very moment. Yes?
I felt like they were gonna end on a high note,
Felt like they were gonna have,
like a fireworks show.
yeah, and why?
It's just,
That's just kind of how it does.
I guess that's I would have expected some things.
Yeah. So even if some of you maybe are not able to verbalize your expectations, regardless of whether you have heard this piece, you have heard music before. And music, for the most part, doesn't just peter out and die away at the very end. There are some pieces that do that, but for the most part, music wants to hit you with all of it's got, all that it has got. That's still not a great sense, but moving on. At the very end, because it wants to leave you with like something great, right? It doesn't want to leave you with like, oh, I don't know what to do anymore, so I'm just gonna slowly die away. So as an audience member, you know, you didn't just receive sound from one musician and then you focused on a second musician and then you focused on another musician. You received sound from everybody, and every single musician in this particular symphony orchestra gave you a auditory representation of the complexities of that piece. And the musicians are trying to communicate with each other, essentially like, okay, this section needs to get quieter because the more important signal is from this other section, et cetera, et cetera. But what I want to emphasize in this particular example, what I'm hoping to emphasize, jury's still out because you guys still aren't really responding to me, save for 2 people. Well done. Well done. Hold on one second. What I do want to, not right now, no. What I do want to emphasize is that perception is not just passive exploration of your environment. Even on the neuronal level, your brain has expectations for how the world works and are going to send signals accordingly. So even if you are in a completely new situation that you have never experienced, your brain has built up enough knowledge up to that point that it is going to essentially fill in the gaps for you, even at this most basic level that we're talking about right now. So tying that back to this video, even the audience has expectations about that piece, and that influences how they processes the sounds as well. But I told you that the audiences were, I told you that the audience was a part of the association cortex. So what you should take that to mean is part of your cortices have already built in expectations of processing, which influence how they are going to respond to the world. And this entire symphony of processing that we see in our brain allows us to have this enriched representation of the complexities of our environment. Yes,
So I don't know if this contradicts everything that you're talking about right now. but
let's try it.
I watched the movie called Whiplash.
Oh, yeah, with the drummer?
Yeah.
Yeah,
and I watched that
international
last
symbol
week,
for drummer.
or about 4 days ago, and I watched that last scene like 4 times because I really liked it.
Yeah.
And over the past 4 days, I swear, all the music I'm listening to, I can only hear drums. Like I'm focusing in on drums and unconsciously.
No, that actually illustrates this point very well. And it might be temporary, or
Yeah.
maybe now you have like a drum fixation for the rest of your life. Which honestly isn't that bad because there's a lot of really good drum riffs out there. But essentially, you maybe in a very short amount of time made it so that your brain just focused in on that particular sound, and now your brain is expecting that sound in a lot of different other areas. Such a good movie. You should all watch it. Whiplash, if you weren't listening to us. So, when we're discussing how the brain is processing visual information, one, it's only when the entire orchestra plays that we get a representation of what the sound should be like. So it's only when all of the neurons are firing that we're able to see the features of a visual stimulus, the angles of the features, the movement, the color, etc., etc. And also, we need to take into account the brain's expectations, because often our expectations override the objective visual stimulus that we have. Have you guys heard of Gestalt psychology? Some of you yes,
Yeah.
not enough of you yes. So those of you who said yes, Gestalt psychology, expectations, we'll get back to that later. I was gonna go into more detail, but I feel like it would be fall on dead ears. Okay, so the other fun thing about this symphony, cancel. The other fun thing about this, there we go, about this particular symphony, what was that? Oh, I was like inception of the computer. All right, the other fun thing about the symphony is that Beethoven actually composed the whole thing without the ability to hear. So he had, I think lead poisoning was the major contributor to his loss of hearing, but he never got to hear this symphony. And it's really an amazing symphony. What I kind of am always entertained by is it's really long. The Germans, Beethoven is German. The Germans, they have anything that you listen to that is by a German composer, at least from the Romantic era previously, is just unnecessarily long. So like if you go and you want to get introduced to opera, start with the Italians, not the Germans. The Germans is like a 4-hour commitment and you're probably not going to make it through. With Beethoven, the funny thing about this particular symphony is it's like the symphony has been playing for an hour and all of a sudden the tenor has to get ready to sing this really high note. But if you can imagine sitting on stage for an hour being like, it's coming up, I gotta get ready with my note, oh my god, here we go. Like this expectation building, and then you have to hit the note right because you don't have any cue, you just have to hope for the best. So I always giggle a little bit when that happens. But anyway, can you imagine composing an entire symphony without getting any auditory feedback, save for vibrations of the instruments? Kind of cool. The biggest contribution I did to myself this morning was I woke up. So there's variations there. Okay, so before we get to the process in the visual system where light waves are changed into neural signals, we got to take a little bit of a step back to see from a farther vantage point, where does this actually happen? So let me just say, cool eye stuff is happening, we're just not going to focus on it. What psychologists are interested in is what occurs at the very back of the eye, which is called the retina. So the retina is where the act of transduction occurs. And so transduction is how you take the light waves that enter your eye and essentially translate them into neural signals that your brain can actually process. Yeah, it's too dark. There we go. Boy, no. Better. Okay. Is that okay? I feel like the other lights were just a little aggressive for a Tuesday. Okay. Or for any day, let's be real. Okay, so transduction happens here, and once the neural signals are formed, they are sent to the back of the brain through what we call the optic nerve. So there's a little bit of a blind spot, and I need to re-look up how to do this, but you can do something with your thumb while facing forward, and you can find your own blind spot. You can be like, I found my blind spot, and that's really all you get from that. But otherwise, think of all of this retinal area is covered with cells whose job is to make sure the brain can listen to or process rather these light waves coming in. So this is the back of the retina. There is actually a very there is a spot in the retina where your vision is the clearest, where you have the highest acuity. That is the fovea. And that is because in that particular area of the retina, which is just above the optic nerve, you have a particular type of photoreceptor cells, which are called cones. So photoreceptor cells, again, these cells are what takes light waves and makes them into neural signals. Cones are there for you to process color. So cones start with a C, color starts with a C. So daylight conditions, your cones are very active. It is easier to see of high acuity when it is light out. In terms of what visible light we can see, it only ranges from about 400 nanometers to about 700 nanometers. Billionths of a meter, if you will. So other species can see different light waves. I think maybe with special glasses you can see something or another. But your cones are specifically set up to see this very, very small range of visible light. So this visible light changes in terms of the length of the light wave, the amplitude of the light wave, and also the acuity of the light wave. But it's actually your brain that fills in the expectation of what those colors should actually be looking like. I hate to bring this up again because I feel like we just go down the rabbit hole, but back to Dressgate 2015, the light waves weren't necessarily lying for your brain. Your brain was putting together what it expects based on the way that those colors were combined together. So we talked about the fovea. Rods, on the other hand, these are more so in your peripheral vision of the retina. Rods are there to transduce wavelengths into black and white colors, or they take in black and white grayscale. So your rods are what are very active in at night vision as well. So that is pretty much all the sensation talk that we are going to have. So how does your brain do this? At the very basic cellular level, really even before that information is getting too far back in the optic nerve, your brain is already making compensations, or let me just say your cell is already making compensations to show you different edges in different stimuli. So your cells in your brain, so let me back up. So just say all of these cells right here, because we're not going to get into too many specifics, are set up to make any edges that you view in your environment very clear. If we're talking of an evolutionary standpoint in psychology, Humans need to watch out for changes. So up until this point, I think you've probably referred to changes as like something coming into your vicinity, or maybe your environment changing, a predator entering or whatever. But your visual system is looking for changes in terms of lightness and darkness. Because what this change in lightness and darkness may indicate is edges of information, so that you avoid bumping into sharp things. Even if you're walking down the hallway and you cut the corner too fast and you run into the corner anyway, your brain was there for you to try to prevent that, but you were too distracted to pay attention. That never happens to me. So lateral inhibition is where cells, if they are close to the edge of other cells, actually inhibit the activity to make those edges stand out. So I'm going to show you this in two different ways. Here, let me show you that. All right, so here we have a bright physical stimulus, and here we have a gray physical stimulus. So the bright light just provides a higher amplitude. It's more signals that are going to be coming into your eyeballs. Because you've looked at like a bright light. I just turned the light on and we were like, ugh, like vampires, right? So this stands out. When information is a little bit darker, it doesn't have quite that stimulation, right? So I have this different combination of lights, and we're all very zen right now. So in order to show this differences between colors, what actually happens is that the cells that are processing the very edge of the colors send even more signals so that they stand out more, and the cells that are processing the edge of the corresponding color actually do less, right? So 1,000 spikes, 1,000 spikes, 1,100 spikes. 90 spikes, 90 spikes, 80 spikes. And these spikes are these signals that are being sent to the back of the brain. So let me show you this in a different way. Is it here? Here we go. Okay. The narrator is really boring. But I want to show you this because at some point in the video, the two rectangles are going to come closer, and you're going to kind of see that edge enhancement. Okay, so just bear with me here.
I'm basically going to move it towards the other one, and we're going to see what happens. Remember, it's a solid gray color. The same color that I have over here is the same color that I have over here and throughout the entire rectangle. Now let's put them together and see if anything happens. So I'm just going to move the one at the right towards the one at the left. And now, hopefully you can see this, depending on the monitor that you're using, you make
blah, blah, blah. Okay, so what I'm hoping happened with your eye adjustment, let me just give you the full viewing experience, is while this rectangle, before he moved it, stop, there we go. It looks kind of the same color. But after you move it so it is right next to the other rectangle, correct me if I'm wrong, does this side seem a little bit lighter than this side now?
I mean, it did before, but
Yeah.
Some yes, some no. I'm not saying your brains are broken. I'm actually just kidding. So, what the process, let me say this, the situation underlying this process is that now your brain has to make sure that you see that there is an edge here. So there is going, since this is the lighter rectangle, there is going to be an increase in the neurons firing, signaling, corresponding to this side of the rectangle, and a decrease on this side. So the edges are still objectively the same, but your brain needs to make them stand out. I kind of think it's, now that I'm looking over here, maybe you can see it a little bit more if you look right there. Does it not seem kind of shadowy dark right here?
Yeah.
A little bit. So that's another example of edge enhancement. It's trying to show you that here, for instance, you're about to have a drop off. And so this is not a dangerous drop off. These are just two freaking rectangles on a computer screen. But imagine if like you're a tiny baby and you're crawling and you are noticing like, oh, there now seems to be a drop off in the thing that I'm crawling towards. So you have two options, tiny baby. You either keep crawling and reap the consequences, or you stop, okay? Because that change in your environment might pose a problem to you. We'll come back to this example later. I can't remember if we get to the shadow example or not.
Is it that your eyes change the color, or the colors are actually two different shades of brown or black or whatever?
No, so so these are two different colors, dark gray, lighter gray. Yeah?
Mhm. Yeah.
They are not, your eyes are not influencing the color. There is nothing influenceable in the musculature or the cellular structure of your eye. But the cells in your eyes are enhancing some spots, unenhancing some spots to just make sure that the edges are standing out.
So basically, your brain is kind of putting together a picture of what it thinks that you need to know for it, or okay.
Yeah. Isn't that nice of your brain? Right? Now you just kind of have to hope that your brain's doing it right. So the wider area is going to kind of have a little bit of a glowy spot, and then the darker area is going to seem especially dark. And again, the stimulus itself objectively did not change, but here is now your brain's representation of it, so that it can clearly show you there is a difference between these two colors. And so lateral inhibition serves to show you that edges are enhanced or unenhanced to show you changes. Okay? Again, humans need to know about change because sometimes change can pose a problem for us. Alright. So in order to go from the very back of the eyeball, which is the retina, that's where all those phototransduction cells were, to the back of the eyeball, to the back of the brain, it is a series of like full symphony action potentials, right? So when I showed you that cell structure, let me go back, right? So what's happening is these cells in the retina, they're referred to as ganglion cells. They eventually bunch all together in this optic nerve. There we go. And after the optic nerve, if you are in a sensation and perception course, you go into that in way more detail, but after the optic nerve, they need to make sure to send it to the first subcortical structure, whose job it is to send it to the rest of the cortex. So, you remember, what did I refer to as the thalamus? I called it something. Do you remember? The relay station, exactly. So the thalamus's job is to relay sensory information from all of the senses to everywhere else. So there's one specific spot on the thalamus, which is called the LGN, or the lateral geniculate nucleus, which specifically relays visual information. There is a specific area on the thalamus that does auditory information, and so on and so on. So also notice that after this information goes on to the thalamus, it is then relayed to association areas of the cortex, which is anywhere besides the sensory strip and the motor strip. So where we tend to see visual information end up is the area V1, which is the visual area of the auditory cortex, the occipital cortex. There we go. It has been a long day. So also notice that within the visual structure, we also see that contralateral processing. We were presented with a little bit of this information to split brain patients, but this is more of a colored visual example. So information in your left visual field is eventually, as long as your corpus callosum is intact, going to end up on your right visual cortex, right visual field, left visual cortex. Okay? So we see that neurons have specific jobs all the way through this entire system. One way we can see that is with single cell recording. I think it's sometimes referred to as patch point recording as well. So single cell recording is a methodology that allows us a better understanding of how cells function within the visual system. And it is a very accurate way of looking at where, so spatial resolution, because you are literally putting an electrode on a specific neuron. You don't get more accurate than that. This is not something we typically do with humans. So, there are no studies here that's like, let me open your brain so I can look at how one cell is firing. So what we're able to see as an example with single cell recording is we can focus on receptive fields of the cells that we saw in the retina and in other areas of the lateral geniculate nucleus. And we can see that some of those cells have certain size targets that provide more excitation than other size targets. So for instance, if you look at, so here's a cell. Here's its general receptive field. As most targets work, you're trying to aim for the center of said receptive field. So notice that when you have stimulation hitting at the center, you actually have a stronger, more action potential. So each one of those lines, each one of those vertical lines is an action potential being sent within neurons to their neighboring neurons. If you do not get directly in the receptive field, you have less activity. If you're getting close to the receptive field, you have a little bit more activity. But with this type of methodology, we are able to see that these cells, at least these cells in this area of the visual system, have center-surround organization. But we have cells in other areas of this entire visual process that have different jobs. Remember, the name of the game here is neuronal specialization. So each neuron has a particular job in terms of processing. Each musician had a particular job in terms of contributing to the particular symphony that we just heard. So if you listen to one musician, you don't get a great representation of what's going on in our world. But if you listen to all of them together in synchrony, well, now you are able to gain a example of the complexity that you are actually experiencing. So we talked about the lateral geniculate nucleus. Now let's jump all the way back to the occipital cortex to area V1. So area V1 does not necessarily have center surround cells. Rather, it has neurons that are a little bit of drama in terms of what they like in the orientation of features or the specific orientation of edges. So we sometimes call these neurons feature detectors because that's literally their job. Some neurons like it when a feature is diagonal, right? Some neurons like it when a feature is horizontal, like what you see with the edge of this lectern. That is vertical, sorry. That is not horizontal. Some cells like it when the edge is actually horizontal, not vertical faking being horizontal, and so on, okay? But yeah, even as you're just looking onto the screen, if you look at the edge of the screen, technically those are 4 features, 2 horizontal features and 2 vertical features. But you're not like feature, 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 feature. It's a screen. No, your brain's like, yeah, that's a screen. Okay, at 250 miles per hour. Okay, so these neurons in synchrony essentially put all of their signals together so that your brain is able to have a fairly accurate representation. But that being said, each neuron has a special contribution to that particular process. So what we see when I was describing that we see all the features at once is what we call parallel processing. Parallel processing is something the brain excels in, and it allows us to see and experience our complex world instead of having to process one feature at a time. So going back to the symphony example, parallel processing is hearing every musician together. Serial processing is having the bassist play the entire symphony, then having the trumpet play the entire symphony, then having the French horn play the entire symphony, and having to put together all those puzzle pieces to figure out what's going on. Okay? Not ideal if you need to process your area quick. So the cool thing about this finding was actually developed by Hubel and Wiesel, two researchers who received a Nobel Prize for their work. Is they were essentially trying to figure out, well, how are these neurons working? This was back in the 1960s, and we're gonna watch a video on this. So they had a monkey, they had a little electrode on said little monkey neuron thingy. And they're like, man, this neuron is not firing to save our lives. Then one of the researchers accidentally put the slide in a little cattywampus, a little catty cornered, and it turned out that that neuron just really liked the edge, of like a diagonal edge. So by accident, they were able to discover that, yeah, all right, so these neurons in the visual cortex have these expectations and have these desires as well. So we are actually not going to see this with monkeys, we are going to see this with cats. Unfortunately, cats were harmed in the making of this experiment, but it is going to kind of show us a little bit of an example of how they discovered that neurons prefer specific features in their environment.
They listen to individual nerves.
That's super quiet.
Cells firing in the anesthetized cat as they presented it with different visual images.
I know.
When we started working, Torsten and I, in the late 50s, we set up our first experiments, and they didn't go well because at the beginning we couldn't make cells fire at all. We'd shine lights all over the screen, and nothing seemed to work. And rather by accident, one day, we were shining small spots, either white spots or black spots, onto the screen, and we found that the black dot seemed to be working in a way that at first we couldn't understand until we found that it was the process of slipping the piece of glass into the projector, which swept a line, a very faint, precise, narrow line across the retina. And every time we did that, we'd get a response. We did that, we'd get a...
Oh, oops. Okay, I'm gonna move it back.
At first we couldn't understand.
There we go. Okay. So what we see here is the edge of clear glass. Do you notice, however, that our eyes are making this edge look a little bit different than the white background? So part of that is due to the shadow. But part of that is our eyeballs enhancing that shadow so that we can differentiate that there are two things. So that is that edge enhancement that we were talking about with lateralization. Or not lateralization, lateral inhibition. Now I'm just saying words. Okay? So again, what the researchers accidentally found is that that particular neuron did not care about dots. That particular neuron was very taken with a diagonal line. Okay? And so that led to their discovery of the specialization in the area of the cortex. I was going to say something else, but now I can't. Nope, I can't remember. Okay, so moving back. Yes, kitties had kind of a bad rap in science for a while. They kind of still do. Well, let us keep going. Okay. So there is parallel processing in area V1. There's also parallel processing in the association areas of the cortex as well. So there are two systems that, in conjunction with each other, provide us very important information about our visual world. They are referred to as the what system and the where system. So the where system is what you can refer to it as in the posterior parietal cortex or we also call it the dorsal stream. So that's kind of easier. And so if you think of where and think of the dorsal fin on a dolphin, that's how I connect that information together. Because you're like, oh, where's the dolphin? There, right there, it's his fin. You see what I'm saying? No, it's fine. All right, so the where system is, it really just provides information about where information is in our environment. Because think of it this way, if you are walking into the street, if you want to just like play a nice easy game of Frogger, then it would be very helpful for you to know where things are in that street, right? Is something coming towards you? Is something moving away from you? Should you stop playing chicken with the cars and maybe just make better life choices? Your where stream is helping you figure that out. Again, it's the occipital parietal pathway, because these neural signals have gone all the way to the occipital lobe and are now being shot up to the parietal lobe, which is the lobe on top. Again, individuals, or not again, but individuals who have damage to the where system have either problems with processing motion or they have problems with reaching for information, because the signal that their brain is providing them about where something is not accurate. It's broken. The what system, this is the ventral stream. This is where objects are, or it helps you with the identification of objects. So you get to the occipital lobe, and then that is sent, processed to the temporal lobe. So we call it the occipital temporal pathway. Individuals who have damage to the what system result in different types of visual agnosias. So agnosias are the lack or your inability to process something visually. And we have found that looking at lesion studies with individuals with visual agnosia, we can actually see that there are specific parts of this particular pathway that process specific categories of information. So for instance, we talked about, I think only very briefly, but prosopagnosia. Did we talk about prosopagnosia?
No.
I think just maybe in passing when we were looking at the brain. So you're like, we did that a lot on Thursday. Thanks, layman. So prosopagnosia. What happens with an individual who has prosopagnosia is they have damage in this infratemporal cortex area, specifically in an area called the fusiform face area. We will get to that in much more detail later. But it is a similarly located area in this temporal cortex, and the result is that people can't differentiate faces, which is kind of problematic because humans are so focused on faces even very, very soon after we're born. So a prosopagnosic can tell that people are different, but not from facial information. So this is different from Capgras syndrome. Capgras syndrome is where you recognize your family member, you just think they're an imposter. Prosopagnosia is you can no longer recognize your family member based on information in their facial area. So you have to use it with body type or size or smell or auditory information instead. What we also see is that parallel processing, we don't have to wait for it to get all the way into the cortical visual areas. We see it much earlier as well, but before we get to that, yes ma'am.
What did you say visual agnosia was again?
Visual agnosia is where you have an inability to process visual stuff. So prosopagnosia is a specific example that I use to show the inability to process faces only. But we will see that there are agnosias for man-made objects, for living objects, for, I think that pretty much covers it. Yep, so we'll get to that later. Okay, so if you go back into the earlier in the visual system, we actually see parallel processing in the certain nerve cells of the retina, also the nerve and the optic nerve and the thalamus. So what we see here is that you have two types of cells, parvocellular and magnocellular. Parvocellular is still that center surround reception, but they have smaller receptive fields, and they tend to fire as long as the stimulus is present. Magnocellular cells, larger receptive fields, so it's easier to kind of make a magnocellular cell fire, and they respond more strongly to changes in stimulation. So the parvocellular cells is kind of keeping you, I guess, oriented to your visual environment. The magnocellular cells are there to, while those parvocellular cells are firing, letting you know when change is occurring. But what I'm trying to tell you here is parallel processing didn't just happen in the visual cortex. It's not like signals got all the way to the back of the brain and the brain was like, let's parallel processing now. Does that sound good to you? No. Parallel processing happened all the way at the back of your retina, because if we did not have that type of processing, our brains would not be able to keep up with the complexities of our environment. So this is, we're getting into rather a little bit of a different direction in terms of how we can differentiate between what we're seeing and what we expect to see. So you see something, right? It has different size of light waves, it has different acuity, it has different amplitude of light waves. And your eyes are like, I see things. That is not what they say. They take in that visual light wave stuff. But in order for your brain to give you feedback, that is an active process that is constantly comparing what you know about the world to the new information that is coming in. So it's a very active process, and it also requires a parallel processing symphony of all the different types of information that could be present. So for example, if you see a bird land on your porch, the perception that your brain provides you to show you said bird is a lot more complex than we realize, because it happens so instantaneously. But think of it as you have cells that have to give you color responding to that bird. Emotion is take you out, or is it just chilling on your porch? Form, is it a big bird? Is it a small bird? I don't know what I'm doing. Is it like a dangerous looking bird, cute little tweet bird? And then perception, a little hand, you're saying, oh, is that bird kind of, bouncing towards me, or is that bird off in the distance, right? So if that bird is off in the distance coming towards you, you know you have a problem. Perhaps. All right, but the question that scientists are still trying to figure out, specifically psychologists, is how the heck does all of this happen and essentially come together in a percept that our brain provides us? So we broadly refer to this issue as the binding problem. So the binding problem is, how do we see all these features and say it's a bird? Specifically, it's a robin, if you know your birds, which you should. Okay, so the binding problem is every single visual experience that you have has more than one feature. So how does your brain combine the features into a percept that makes sense? Rather, why do we see like a coherent wall instead of just multiple wood-colored rectangles, kind of like free-floating, just doing their own psychedelic thing over there? Why are you able to see me as a complete human instead of, if I stand behind here, just like a head and some shoulders? If I wear heels, a little bit more. Okay? All really that psychologists know is that we're able to do it, and we are still parsing together how that happens. We have some ideas, but we're working through it. Okay, so elements that help solve the binding problem are going to kind of illustrate what I was trying to get through to you guys a little bit in our example that we were talking about with the Ode to Joy example. So the first element is, generally speaking, stuff that's close together tends to be processed together. So your parallel processing that is occurring in your visual areas, any part in your visual areas, they generally know where that object is. So if a bird is flying up in that general area, then your brain knows that all these features are of the same object because it's in the same location. How? It just does. Okay? This was kind of, I hope, was illustrated with the particular symphony example, is that the musicians all played on the same beat. Same with the neurons. The neurons that are processing the same object usually tend to fire in a specific synchrony with each other. That's what I mentioned before, neurons that fire together wire together. So neurons that are essentially sending the same signal and the same beat as the neurons around them have learned that, oh, this is the pattern of activation whenever I see this particular visual example. What is perhaps the most critical element in terms of solving the binding problem is attention. It is you directing your focus towards something in your visual system. So, why do we know attention is so important? Is that we can actually put you in certain research situations and completely overload your perceptual system, and we can anticipate what type of errors that you will make. We call these errors conjunction errors. So to give you an example, I can show you a red circle and a green triangle, and on the next trial I can show you a different circle and a different triangle. And during the test phase, I can show you a green circle. And what happened is, in error, you combined the features of the triangle and the circle because they were shown together. So because either the picture went too fast or you weren't really paying attention, you combined the wrong stuff at the wrong time. Okay? If you've ever misremembered something, usually the culprit is because you didn't focus your attention on that something to begin with. We also see that individuals with deficits in being able to pay attention also have a problem in combining features in a helpful way. We will see this a little bit when we talk about hemispatial neglect in stroke victims, so more on that later. And finally, we see neural synchrony for attention. So if your attention is focused on something, that may be the underlying reason why this neural firing starts following the same rhythm to begin with. But you have to pay attention to it, not just kind of flippantly pay attention to it. And you remember all that cell phone stuff and technology stuff we spent so long talking about in this course? And you're like, man, now she's making us watch a video. She showed us science about it. Now we have to watch this whodunit video. Do you remember that? I feel better about myself. The reason why we took so much time, especially in this course, is because if you're ever going to put your environment together in a percept that you can use later, you have to pay attention. If attention's not there, it's as if it never happened. So if your attention is directed to something else, that really compromises your ability to take the outside in and use it later. And if this were just a one and done class, like you didn't ever have to come back to this information ever again, you could do what you wanted. The problem is eventually you're gonna be tested over it. I can't just like say, you know what, I feel like you've got this, let's just waive the first exam. That's not how life works. Trust me, I wish it did. So you have to make sure you're allocating your attention so your brain can follow up and process it accordingly. You know what, I know it is a little early, but let's go ahead and call it for today.